The small town of Fairview, nestled in the heart of Vermont, was blanketed in a thick layer of snow as winter tightened its icy grip. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional crunch of tires on salt-covered roads and the distant laughter of children enjoying their snow days. Among the quaint houses that lined Maple Street, one stood out, a charming two-story colonial with faded blue shutters and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. This was the home of Margaret Whitmore, a 78-year-old widow who had spent the better part of 6 decades in Fairview. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her frost-covered lawn, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, a crocheted blanket draped over her knees. The house creaked and settled around her, its familiar sounds a constant reminder of the life she had built here with her late husband, George. Margaret's gnarled fingers absently traced the pattern on her teacup as she gazed out the window. The street lamps flickered to life, their warm glow a stark contrast to the gathering darkness. She sighed, her breath fogging the cold glass. It had been 12 years since George passed, leaving her to navigate the twilight of her life alone. Their children, Sarah and Michael, had long since moved away, Sarah to bustling New York City and Michael to sunny California. They called regularly and visited on major holidays, but it wasn't the same as having them close by. As she watched the first few snowflakes of the evening begin to fall, Margaret's thoughts drifted to the coming days. Tomorrow was Thursday, which meant Mrs. Peterson from next door would stop by for their weekly game of gin rummy. On Friday, young Jimmy from down the street would shovel her driveway, a task she insisted on paying him for, despite his parents' protests. These small interactions were the threads that kept Margaret connected to the world outside her 4 walls. With a soft grunt, Margaret pushed herself up from her chair. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 7 times, reminding her that it was time to stoke the fire. She shuffled to the kitchen, her slippered feet whispering against the worn hardwood floors. The house was chilly despite the central heating, an old home's stubborn refusal to fully embrace modernity. As she reached for the back door, intending to fetch more firewood from the shed, a sound caught her attention. At first, she thought it might be the wind, which had picked up considerably since sundown. But there it was again, a soft, plaintive whine that seemed to come from just beyond her garden fence. Margaret hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. At her age, venturing out into a snowstorm at night wasn't the wisest decision. But something in that sound tugged at her heart. With a determined set to her jaw, the same expression that had seen her through raising 2 children and supporting George through his long illness, she grabbed her heavy wool coat from its peg and wrapped a thick scarf around her neck. The blast of cold air that greeted her as she stepped onto the back porch nearly took her breath away. Margaret squinted against the swirling snow, her eyes watering in the biting wind. The security light flickered on, casting a pool of yellow across the snow-covered yard. She took a tentative step forward, then another, her rubber-soled boots crunching in the fresh powder. "Hello," she called out, her voice thin and reedy in the howling wind. "Is someone there?" For a moment, there was nothing but the storm. Then, as if in answer to her question, the whine came again, louder this time, and unmistakably distressed. Margaret moved towards the sound, her arthritic hip protesting with each step. As she neared the back fence, she saw a large, dark shape huddled against the weathered wood. Her heart pounding, Margaret inched closer. The security light's glow barely reached this far, but it was enough for her to make out the form of a dog, a big one. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could see it was a German shepherd, its thick coat matted with snow and ice. "Oh, you poor thing," Margaret murmured, kneeling down beside the trembling animal. Up close, she could see how thin it was, its ribs visible even through its winter coat. The dog raised its head weakly, amber eyes meeting hers with a look that spoke of exhaustion and pain. Without a second thought, Margaret began to unbutton her coat. "It's all right," she soothed, her voice taking on the same tone she had used with her children when they were sick or scared. "I'm going to help you. We need to get you inside and warmed up." Gently, she draped her coat over the dog's shivering form. It whined softly but made no move to resist as she carefully slipped her arms underneath its body. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself for the effort to come. She wasn't as strong as she once was, but a lifetime of gardening and household chores had left her with more strength than her slight frame suggested. With a grunt of exertion, Margaret lifted the dog. Its weight nearly toppled her, but she managed to find her balance. Slowly, step by careful step, she made her way back to the house. The wind howled around them, driving the snow horizontally, but Margaret was focused solely on the warm light spilling from her kitchen window, a beacon guiding them to safety. By the time she reached the back door, Margaret's arms were shaking with the effort of carrying the large dog. She fumbled with the handle, nearly dropping her burden in the process, but finally managed to shoulder the door open. The sudden warmth of the kitchen enveloped them as she staggered inside, kicking the door shut behind her. With the last of her strength, Margaret lowered the dog onto the braided rug in front of the old wood stove. She quickly stoked the fire, adding another log to build up the heat. As the flames crackled to life, casting a warm glow across the kitchen, Margaret turned her attention back to her unexpected guest. The dog lay still, its eyes closed and its breathing shallow. Now that they were in the light, Margaret could see that it was a male, probably a few years old. His coat, though dirty and matted, showed signs of once being well cared for. There was no collar, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a stray, this was a dog that had known a home and somehow lost his way. Moving as quickly as her tired body would allow, Margaret gathered old towels and blankets. She gently dried the dog's fur, murmuring words of comfort as she worked. Once she had him as dry as possible, she covered him with a thick wool blanket, one that George had always favored for winter nights on the porch. "There now," she said softly, stroking the dog's head. "You're safe here. We'll get you feeling better in no time." As if in response to her words, the dog's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, his gaze darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. Then his eyes locked onto Margaret's face. There was intelligence in that gaze, and something else, a flicker of gratitude that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. "Well, aren't you something?" she whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. "Don't you worry. I'll take care of you." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, a weak gesture, but one that filled Margaret with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. As she watched him drift off into an exhausted sleep, Margaret realized that her quiet, predictable life had just taken an unexpected turn. And for the first time in a long while, she found herself looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking the passage of time as Margaret settled into a chair next to her new companion. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside this old house on Maple Street, a spark of hope had been kindled, a promise of companionship and purpose that neither Margaret nor the mysterious dog could have anticipated when the day began. As the night deepened, Margaret dozed in her chair, one hand resting gently on the dog's back. In his sleep, the dog shifted closer to her, seeking the warmth and comfort of human touch. And so they remained, an unlikely pair brought together by chance and kindness, as Fairview slumbered peacefully around them, unaware of the small miracle that had occurred in their midst. The pale winter sun had barely crested the horizon when Margaret stirred from her uncomfortable slumber in the kitchen chair. For a moment, she was disoriented, her joints stiff and aching from the awkward position. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back as her eyes fell on the large German shepherd still curled up on the rug by the stove. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, a mix of wonder and concern in her voice. The dog's eyes opened at the sound, fixing on her with that same intelligent gaze she'd noticed the night before. His tail thumped weakly against the floor, a tentative greeting. Margaret leaned forward, wincing as her back protested the movement. "How are you feeling this morning, boy?" she asked softly, reaching out a hand. The dog watched her carefully but didn't shy away as she gently stroked his head. His fur was still matted and dirty, but the trembling from the night before had subsided. With a groan, Margaret pushed herself to her feet. "First things first," she said, more to herself than to her canine guest. "Let's see about getting you some food and water." As she moved about the kitchen, filling a bowl with water and rummaging through her refrigerator for something suitable for a dog to eat, Margaret's mind raced. She'd never owned a dog herself, George had been allergic, but she remembered her neighbor's golden retriever from years ago. What had Mrs. Johnson fed that dog? Chicken, she recalled. Chicken and rice. "I suppose that'll have to do for now," Margaret muttered, pulling out leftover chicken from last night's dinner. As she warmed it slightly and mixed it with some plain rice, she glanced back at the dog. He had managed to sit up, though he still looked weak and wary. You know, she said conversationally as she set the bowls of food and water in front of him, if you're going to be staying here for a bit, I ought to call you something. How about Max? You look like a Max to me. The newly christened Max's ears perked up at the name, and he sniffed cautiously at the offered food before beginning to eat with careful, measured bites. Margaret smiled, settling back into her chair to watch him. Max it is, then. Over the next few days, a routine began to develop in the Whitmore household. Margaret, who had grown accustomed to long, quiet days punctuated only by the ticking of clocks and the occasional ring of the telephone, found herself with a new sense of purpose. Max needed care, and Margaret threw herself into the task with a vigor that surprised her. She bathed him carefully in the downstairs bathroom, using warm water and a mild soap to work out the tangles and grime from his coat. As she did, she couldn't help but notice the various scars that marked his body, old injuries that spoke of a difficult past. You've been through quite a lot, haven't you? She murmured, gently working a particularly stubborn knot out of his fur. Max whined softly in response, leaning into her touch. Margaret also tended to his paws, which had been cracked and bleeding when she found him. She applied a salve that she'd once used on George's hands when the cold weather had made them rough and chapped. Max seemed to appreciate the care, holding still as she wrapped his paws in soft bandages. As Max's health improved, so did his demeanor. The wariness in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a growing trust. He started to follow Margaret around the house, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors as he trailed her from room to room. At night, he slept on the rug by her bed, a silent guardian. Margaret found herself talking to Max more and more. She'd always been in the habit of speaking her thoughts aloud, a trait that had amused George to no end, but now she had an attentive audience. She told Max about her day, about the phone call from her daughter Sarah, about the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom that she really ought to get fixed. You know, Max, she said one afternoon as she worked on her knitting, the clicking of her needles a soothing counterpoint to the howling wind outside, I never thought I'd have company like this again. It's nice, isn't it? Max, who had been dozing by the fireplace, lifted his head and gave a soft woof in response. Margaret chuckled, shaking her head. I suppose that's agreement enough. It was later that same day when Margaret had her first inkling that Max was no ordinary dog. She'd dropped her knitting needles, the smooth metal rolling under the coffee table. Before she could even think about how she was going to bend down to retrieve them, Max was there. He ducked his head under the table and came back with the needles held gently in his mouth, depositing them in her lap. Margaret stared at him in astonishment. Well, I'll be, she breathed. Aren't you the clever one? Max's tail wagged, his eyes bright with what Margaret could have sworn was pride. It was more than just the act of retrieving the needles, it was the look in his eyes, a sharp intelligence that went beyond mere canine instinct. Curious now, Margaret decided to test her theory. She stood up, wincing slightly at the twinge in her hip, and walked to the bookshelf that dominated one wall of her living room. Max followed, watching intently as she ran her fingers along the spines of old books. Let's see, she mused, pulling out a battered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, one of George's favorites. She flipped through it until she found what she was looking for, an old newspaper clipping they'd used as a bookmark years ago. It was yellowed with age, but the photograph was still clear, a police dog being honored for bravery in the line of duty. Margaret gasped softly as she looked from the photo to Maximum. The resemblance was uncanny, right down to a distinctive scar near the ear. Max, she said slowly, you're not just any dog, are you? You were a police dog. Max's reaction was immediate. His ears pricked forward, and he let out a short, sharp bark, the first real vocalization she'd heard from him since that night in the storm. His tail wagged furiously, and he pawed at her leg as if trying to confirm her discovery. Margaret sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. Oh my, she breathed. What in the world happened to you? How did you end up out there in that storm? Max whined softly, pressing his head against her knee. Margaret stroked his ears absently, her thoughts racing. A trained police dog, no wonder he was so intelligent, so attuned to her needs. But why wasn't he with his handler? And how long had he been on his own before she found him? As the questions swirled in her mind, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. Max wasn't just a stray she'd taken in, he was a hero, a dog who had dedicated his life to serving others. And now, for whatever reason, he needed her help. "Well, Max," she said firmly, looking into those intelligent amber eyes, "I don't know what brought you to my doorstep, but I promise you this, we'll figure it out together. You're safe here, and we'll get to the bottom of your story." Max's tail thumped against the floor, a steady rhythm that seemed to say, "I trust you." And in that moment, as the winter sun began to set outside and the room filled with the warm glow of the table lamp, Margaret felt a connection she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just that she was helping Max in his own way, Max was helping her too, filling a void in her life she hadn't even realized was there. As she settled back in her chair, reaching for her knitting once more, Margaret smiled to herself. Life had a funny way of surprising you, she thought. Just when you think you've got it all figured out, a storm blows in and changes everything. But sometimes, she realized as she glanced down at Max's now sleeping form, those changes were exactly what you needed. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour. Outside, Fairview settled into another quiet winter evening. But inside the old house on Maple Street, a new chapter was beginning, one of friendship, trust, and the unexpected adventures that come when two lonely souls find each other. As January deepened its grip on Fairview, the days grew shorter and the nights longer. The town, nestled in its snowy cocoon, seemed to hibernate, with most residents preferring the warmth of their homes to the bitter cold outside. For Margaret Whitmore, however, the winter months had taken on a new rhythm, one dictated by the gentle presence of Max, her unexpected canine companion. Their days fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings began with a shared breakfast, oatmeal for Margaret, and a bowl of kibble mixed with some scrambled egg for Maximum. She'd picked up proper dog food on her last trip to the grocery store, feeling a bit like a new parent as she'd scrutinized the labels, determined to choose the best for her four-legged friend. After breakfast, they'd venture out for a short walk. Despite the cold, Margaret found herself looking forward to these outings. Max moved carefully on the icy sidewalks, always staying close to her side, as if aware of her fragility. More than once, his sturdy presence had steadied her when a patch of black ice threatened her balance. "You're better than any walking stick," Margaret would chuckle, patting his broad head affectionately. As they walked, Margaret couldn't help but notice the way Max's ears would perk up at every sound, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. It was a reminder of his past life as a police dog, a fact that both intrigued and saddened her. What circumstances had led him to her doorstep that stormy night? Their afternoons were spent in companionable quiet. Margaret would read or knit, occasionally sharing passages from her book out loud. Max would listen attentively, his amber eyes fixed on her face as if he understood every word. Sometimes, she'd catch herself wondering if he did. It was during one of these peaceful afternoons when Margaret first heard the whispers of trouble in Fairview. She tuned into the local radio station, as she did every day at 2 p.m. for the community bulletin. Usually, it was a stream of benign announcements, bake sales, town council meetings, and reminders about snow removal. But today, the announcer's voice held a note of concern. Fairview Police Department urges residents, especially our senior citizens, to be extra vigilant. There have been reports of suspicious activity in neighboring towns, with several break-ins targeting elderly homeowners. While no such incidents have occurred in Fairview, Chief Wilson advises everyone to keep their doors locked and report any unusual sightings. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. She glanced at Max, who had lifted his head at the change in her posture. "Well," she said, trying to keep her voice light, "I suppose we'll have to be a bit more careful, won't we?" Max gave a low woof in response, his tail thumping against the floor. Margaret smiled, feeling some of her unease dissipate. With Max by her side, she felt safer than she had in years. As the days passed, the news from neighboring towns grew more concerning. The break-ins were becoming more frequent, and the perpetrators more bold. Margaret found herself double-checking the locks before bed each night, a habit she hadn't felt the need for in all her years in Fairview. One evening, as a particularly fierce snowstorm howled outside, Margaret stood by the living room window, cup of chamomile tea in hand. The streetlights cast an eerie glow on the deserted street, the swirling snow creating ghostly shapes in the darkness. "It's nights like these that make me miss your grandpa George the most," Margaret said softly to Max, who lay at her feet. He always knew how to make the house feel safe and warm, no matter what was happening outside. Max lifted his head, ears twitching. For a moment, Margaret thought he was responding to her words. Then she saw his muscles tense, a low growl building in his throat. "What is it, boy?" she asked, setting her tea down on the windowsill. Max was on his feet now, his attention focused intently on the front door. The growl grew louder, a sound Margaret had never heard from him before. Heart pounding, Margaret peered out into the night. At first, she saw nothing but swirling snow. Then, a movement caught her eye, a dark shape moving swiftly across her front yard. "Oh my," she breathed, her hand flying to her throat. Was it just a neighbor, hurrying home in the storm? But as she watched, a second figure emerged from the shadows, joining the first at the edge of her property. Max's growl had turned into a series of sharp, commanding barks. He positioned himself between Margaret and the door, his posture rigid and alert. In that moment, Margaret saw not her gentle companion, but the trained police dog he had once been. The figures outside seemed to hesitate, clearly thrown by the sound of a large dog. Margaret could hear muffled voices, though the words were lost in the howling wind. She watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the two shapes conferred for a moment before melting back into the darkness. Only when they had disappeared completely did Max's barking subside. He turned to look at Margaret, as if checking that she was all right. "Good boy," she said shakily, her knees suddenly weak. She sank into her armchair, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You scared them off, didn't you? My brave boy." Max padded over to her, resting his head on her knee. Margaret stroked his fur absently, her mind racing. Those figures had been heading straight for her house, she was sure of it. If Max hadn't been there, the thought sent another shiver down her spine. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt truly vulnerable in her own home. The Fairview she knew, the safe, friendly town where everyone looked out for each other, suddenly seemed like a distant memory. As the night wore on, Margaret found herself unable to sleep. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind, had her sitting up in bed, heart racing. Max remained vigilant, occasionally getting up to pace the room before settling back at the foot of her bed. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Fairview blanketed in a fresh layer of snow. Margaret, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, peered out her front window. The street was quiet, pristine white, broken only by the tracks of early morning plows. "I suppose we should report what happened," she mused aloud to Max as she sipped her morning coffee. The events of the night before felt almost dreamlike in the clear light of day, but the lingering unease in her gut told her it had been all too real. With a sigh, Margaret reached for the phone. As she dialed the number for the Fairview Police Department, she felt a mix of emotions: fear at the realization of how close she'd come to danger, gratitude for Max's protection, and a steely determination she hadn't felt in years. "Fairview Police Department, how can I help you?" a friendly voice answered. Margaret took a deep breath. "Yes, hello. This is Margaret Whitmore from 1242 Maple Street. I think I need to report an attempted break-in." As she recounted the events of the previous night, Margaret felt Max's reassuring presence at her side. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she realized, she wouldn't have to face them alone. In the quiet aftermath of a harrowing night, as Fairview began to stir to life outside her windows, Margaret found herself facing an unexpected truth. Sometimes, the most unlikely companions could become our greatest protectors. The officer on the phone assured her that someone would be sent over to take a full statement and check the property. As Margaret hung up, she looked down at Max, who gazed back at her with unwavering loyalty. "Well, my friend," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips, "it seems our quiet life just got a bit more exciting. But together, I think we can handle whatever comes our way." Max's tail wagged in agreement, and for the first time since the previous night, Margaret felt the knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. The shadows of the night had brought danger to her doorstep, but they had also revealed the strength of the bond between a lonely widow and a lost police dog, a bond that, Margaret was beginning to realize, might just be the saving grace they both needed. The morning after the attempted break-in dawned clear and crisp, the world outside Margaret's window a glittering expanse of fresh snow. Despite the beauty, Margaret felt a lingering unease as she went about her morning routine. She found herself jumping at small noises, her eyes constantly darting to the windows. Max, sensing her anxiety, stayed close by her side, his steady presence a comfort in the aftermath of the previous night's scare. As Margaret was finishing up the breakfast dishes, the sound of tires crunching on snow caught her attention. She peered out the kitchen window to see a police cruiser pulling up in front of her house. Max's ears perked up, his tail wagging slightly as if in recognition. "Well, that was quick," Margaret murmured, drying her hands on a dish towel. She made her way to the front door, Max at her heels, and opened it just as the officer was about to knock. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the man asked, his breath visible in the cold air. He was middle-aged, with kind eyes and smile lines etched deeply around his mouth. "I'm Inspector Jack Turner. I'm here about the report you filed this morning." Margaret nodded, stepping back to allow him entry. "Yes, of course. Please, come in out of the cold." As Inspector Turner stepped into the warm foyer, shaking the snow from his boots, his eyes fell on Maximum. The change in his demeanor was immediate and startling. His professional mask slipped, replaced by an expression of utter disbelief. "It can't be," he breathed, dropping to one knee. "Maximus? Is that really you, boy?" Max, who had been watching the inspector cautiously, suddenly let out a joyful bark. His tail wagged furiously as he bounded forward, nearly knocking the inspector over in his enthusiasm. Margaret watched in amazement as Max showered the officer with affection, whining softly and nuzzling against him. Inspector Turner laughed, his eyes suspiciously bright as he ruffled Max's fur. "I don't believe it," he said, looking up at Margaret. Was my partner. He went missing over 6 months ago. We searched everywhere, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. Margaret felt a rush of emotions, surprise, relief, and a twinge of something that felt suspiciously like disappointment. "Your partner," she echoed. "You mean, Max was a police dog?" Inspector Turner nodded, finally standing up though he kept one hand on Max's head. "The best I've ever worked with. We were on a case, tracking a suspect through some rough terrain. There was an accident, I got knocked out, and when I came to, Max was gone. We thought maybe he'd been injured, or..." He swallowed hard. "Well, we feared the worst." Margaret led them into the living room, her mind whirling as she tried to process this new information. As they settled onto the couch, Max positioning himself between them, she recounted the story of how she'd found him that stormy night. "He was in rough shape," she explained, unconsciously reaching out to stroke Max's fur. "Thin, cold, his paws all cut up. I couldn't just leave him out there." Inspector Turner listened intently, his expression a mix of gratitude and professional interest. When Margaret described the events of the previous night, his brow furrowed with concern. "You did the right thing, calling us," he said. "We've been tracking these break-ins for weeks now. They've been hitting towns all around Fairview, always targeting older residents living alone." He paused, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Though I bet they weren't expecting to run into a retired police dog." Margaret couldn't help but chuckle at that. "No, I suppose they weren't. Max certainly gave them a fright." As they continued to talk, Margaret found herself warming to Inspector Turner. He had a gentle manner that put her at ease, and the obvious affection between him and Max spoke volumes about his character. He asked her several questions about what she'd seen, jotting down notes in a small notebook. "Now, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone turning serious. "Given what happened last night, I'd like to talk about improving the security of your home. These criminals, they tend to come back to places they've already scoped out. We need to make sure you're safe." Margaret nodded, feeling a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "What do you suggest?" Inspector Turner outlined a series of measures: new locks, a security system, motion sensor lights for the exterior of the house. As he spoke, Margaret couldn't help but think of how George would have reacted to all this. He'd always been so proud of Fairview's safety, often leaving the door unlocked when he'd run to the store. How times had changed. "I know it seems like a lot," Inspector Turner said gently, noticing her overwhelmed expression. "But please, don't worry. We'll help you get everything set up." And, he added with a smile, it looks like you've already got one of the best security systems money can buy right here. He patted Max's side affectionately. As their conversation wound down, an awkward silence fell. Margaret knew what was coming next, but she found herself reluctant to broach the subject. It was Inspector Turner who finally spoke up. Mrs. Whitmore, he began, his tone careful. I can't thank you enough for taking care of Maximum. You saved his life, no doubt about it. And I know this is a lot to ask, but, well, I was hoping I could bring him home. Back to the force. Margaret felt her heart sink. She'd known this moment would come from the instant Inspector Turner had recognized Max, but that didn't make it any easier. Over the past weeks, Max had become more than just a pet. He'd been a friend, a protector, a reason to get up in the morning. Of course, she said, forcing a smile. He's your partner. And I'm sure he's missed you terribly. Inspector Turner studied her face for a moment, then looked down at Max, who was glancing between the two humans, his tail wagging uncertainly. You know, he said slowly, Max was actually due to retire soon. The accident that separated us, well, it took a toll on him. The vet said he probably wouldn't be fit for active duty again. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. What I'm trying to say is, maybe this is where he's meant to be now. Margaret blinked, hardly daring to hope. You mean? Inspector Turner nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. If you're willing, I think Max has found his retirement home. He clearly adores you, and after what happened last night, I'd feel a lot better knowing he was here looking out for you. The relief that washed over Margaret was so intense she felt tears prick at her eyes. Oh, I'd love that, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But are you sure? I know how much he means to you. I am, Inspector Turner said firmly. But if it's all right with you, I'd like to stop by now and then. Check in on both of you, maybe take Max for a walk down memory lane. Of course, Margaret agreed readily. You're welcome any time. As Inspector Turner prepared to leave, promising to return the next day to start on the security upgrades, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. She watched as he knelt down to say goodbye to Max, whispering something in the dog's ear that made his tail wag happily. When the door closed behind the inspector, Margaret looked down at Maximum. Well, she said, scratching behind his ears, it looks like you and I are stuck with each other, old boy. Max's response was to press his head against her leg, looking up at her with those soulful eyes that seemed to understand far more than any dog should. As she moved to the window, watching Inspector Turner's cruiser disappear down the snowy street, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world outside might be changing, growing a little colder and more uncertain, but here in this house, she and Max had found something precious, a second chance, a new family forged in the most unexpected of circumstances. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed, marking the hour. Margaret turned from the window, a small smile playing on her lips. Come on, Max, she said. I think this calls for a celebration. How about we bake some cookies? Max's enthusiastic bark was all the answer she needed. As they made their way to the kitchen together, Margaret couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with warmth, companionship, and the kind of adventures that come when life takes an unexpected turn for the better. The days following Inspector Turner's visit brought a flurry of activity to Margaret's usually quiet home. True to his word, the inspector returned the next morning, accompanied by a team of security experts. Margaret watched with a mixture of fascination and trepidation as they went about their work, installing new locks, setting up a state-of-the-art alarm system, and mounting motion-activated lights around the exterior of the house. It's like Fort Knox, Margaret murmured to Max, who sat loyally by her side as they observed the proceedings from the living room window. The German shepherd tilted his head, as if considering her words, before giving a soft woof of agreement. Inspector Turner, overseeing the installation, caught her eye and offered a reassuring smile. I know it seems like a lot, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, crossing the room to join them. But trust me, you'll sleep easier knowing you've got all this in place. Margaret nodded, trying to push down the twinge of sadness she felt at the need for such measures. I suppose you're right, she sighed. It's just, this isn't the Fairview I remember. The inspector's expression softened. Times change, he acknowledged. But that doesn't mean we can't adapt. And speaking of adapting, he added, a twinkle in his eye as he looked down at Max, how's this old-timer settling in? At the sound of his former partner's voice, Max's tail began to wag furiously. Margaret couldn't help but smile. Oh, he's been a perfect gentleman, she said, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. Though I think he misses going on proper walks. My old bones can't keep up with him for too long, I'm afraid. Inspector Turner nodded thoughtfully. You know, he said, I might have a solution for that. Give me a day or two to make some calls. Before Margaret could ask what he meant, one of the security technicians called him over to discuss some aspect of the installation. Left alone with Max, Margaret found herself wondering what the inspector had in mind. She didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, as Margaret was just finishing up her morning coffee, there was a knock at the door. Max, who had been dozing in a patch of sunlight, immediately perked up, his ears swiveling towards the sound. Cautiously, Margaret approached the door, peering through the newly installed peephole. To her surprise, she saw not only Inspector Turner but also a young man she didn't recognize. Intrigued, she opened the door. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore, Inspector Turner greeted her cheerfully. I hope we're not interrupting your morning. This is Daniel Thompson, he gestured to the young man beside him. He lives just a couple of streets over and has kindly volunteered to help out. Daniel, a tall, lanky youth with a mop of unruly brown hair, gave a shy wave. Hi, Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Inspector Turner told me about Maximum. I used to walk dogs at the shelter before I started college, and I thought maybe I could help out. You know, take him for longer walks, play fetch, that kind of thing. Margaret blinked in surprise, looking from Daniel to the inspector and back again. Oh, she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. Oh, that would be wonderful. But Daniel, dear, are you sure? I wouldn't want to impose on your time. Daniel's face lit up with a grin. It's no imposition at all, Honestly, I miss working with dogs. And, he added with a chuckle, it'll be a good excuse to get some exercise myself. College food isn't doing my waistline any favors. As if on cue, Max appeared at Margaret's side, his tail wagging as he took in the newcomers. Daniel knelt down, allowing Max to sniff his hand before gently scratching under the dog's chin. The ease with which Max accepted the young man's attention warmed Margaret's heart. Well then, she said, stepping back to allow them entry, why don't you all come in and we can discuss the details over some tea? As they settled in the living room, Margaret couldn't help but marvel at how quickly her life had changed. Just weeks ago, she had been facing a long, lonely winter. Now, her home was filled with warmth and conversation, centered around the furry companion who had stumbled into her life on that stormy night. Over the next few days, Margaret's world expanded in ways she hadn't thought possible. Daniel became a regular fixture, arriving every afternoon to take Max for long walks through the neighborhood. He'd often stay for a cup of tea afterward, regaling Margaret with stories of his classes and campus life. His youthful energy was infectious, and Margaret found herself looking forward to his visits almost as much as Max did. But Daniel wasn't the only new addition to Margaret's life. Word of the attempted break-in had spread through Fairview's tight-knit community, and suddenly, Margaret found herself at the center of a web of concern and support. Mrs. Harper from next door began stopping by more frequently, often with a freshly baked pie or casserole in hand. Just a little something I whipped up, she'd say with a wink, though Margaret suspected the sudden influx of home-cooked meals was her neighbor's way of checking in on her. Mr. Johnson, whose hardware store had been a Fairview fixture for decades, showed up one afternoon with a toolbox in hand. Heard you might need some help with that leaky faucet, he said gruffly, though his eyes twinkled kindly. Can't have you worrying about that on top of everything else. Even the local children, who had always viewed Margaret's house with the vague disinterest of youth, began to take notice. A group of them, led by little Sarah from across the street, knocked on her door one Saturday morning. We heard you have a police dog now, Sarah said, her eyes wide with excitement. Could we maybe see him? Margaret, touched by their interest, invited them into the backyard where Max was sunbathing. The dog, seeming to sense the importance of the moment, was on his best behavior, gently accepting pets and even performing a few simple tricks that had the children squealing with delight. As she watched Max interact with the children, Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. This, she realized, was what community truly meant. It wasn't just about living in the same town or exchanging pleasantries at the grocery store. It was about coming together in times of need, about looking out for one another. Inspector Turner continued to drop by regularly, ostensibly to check on the security system but mainly, Margaret suspected, to visit with Maximum. During one such visit, as they sat on the porch watching Max and Daniel play fetch in the yard, the inspector turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking. The department's been looking for ways to connect more with the community, especially with our senior residents. What would you think about hosting a neighborhood watch meeting here? Nothing too formal, just a chance for folks to come together, learn some safety tips, that sort of thing." Margaret considered the idea. A month ago, the thought of hosting such a gathering would have overwhelmed her. But now, bolstered by the support of her neighbors and the comforting presence of Max, she found herself nodding. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said. "And I'm sure Max would love to be the center of attention." The inspector laughed. "Oh, I'm counting on it. He always was a bit of a show-off." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. The world outside might still hold its dangers, but here, in this home and this community, she had found something precious. It wasn't just about feeling safe, though that was certainly part of it. It was about feeling connected, valued, part of something larger than herself. Later that night, as she prepared for bed with Max curled up on his rug nearby, Margaret paused to look out the window. The street below was quiet, the new security lights casting a soft glow over her front yard. But beyond that, she could see lights in other windows, signs of life and warmth in the homes of her neighbors. "You know, Max," she said softly, "I think we're going to be just fine." Max lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers with that uncanny intelligence she had come to cherish. His tail thumped once against the floor, a gesture of agreement and reassurance. As Margaret slipped under the covers, she felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow would bring Daniel's visit, perhaps a call from her daughter, maybe even some planning for the upcoming neighborhood watch meeting. Small things, perhaps, but they were threads weaving together to create a tapestry of purpose and connection. In the quiet of the night, as Fairview slumbered around them, Margaret drifted off to sleep, Max's steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the darkness. The shadows that had once seemed so threatening now held no power here. In their place was a sense of renewed purpose, a reminder that even in the winter of life, new beginnings were possible. As winter gradually gave way to spring in Fairview, the transformation in Margaret Whitmore's life was nothing short of remarkable. The once quiet house on Maple Street had become a hub of activity, filled with the warmth of newfound friendships and the gentle presence of Max, the retired police dog who had changed everything. The neighborhood watch meeting, suggested by Inspector Turner, had been a resounding success. Margaret's living room had been packed with neighbors, all eager to learn about home safety and, perhaps more importantly, to catch a glimpse of the heroic dog they'd all heard about. Max, true to form, had been the perfect host, moving from person to person with dignified grace, accepting pets and offering comforting nudges to those who seemed nervous. In the weeks that followed, Margaret found herself fielding requests from various community groups. The local elementary school wanted to know if she and Max could visit for a special assembly on safety. The senior center asked if they might stop by for their monthly social gathering. Even the Fairview Gazette expressed interest in doing a feature story on the unlikely pair. At first, Margaret had been overwhelmed by the attention. She was, after all, just a widow who had taken in a stray dog. But as she watched Max interact with people, saw the way his presence brought smiles to faces and eased tensions, she began to understand. They weren't just a widow and a dog, they were a symbol of something larger: resilience, companionship, and the unexpected ways life could bring purpose and joy. One sunny afternoon in early April, as Margaret sat on her front porch watching Daniel and Max play fetch in the yard, she heard the excited chatter of approaching children. A group from the neighborhood, led by Sarah from across the street, came bounding up the walk. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah called out, her pigtails bouncing with each step. "Can Max come out to play? We made him something." Intrigued, Margaret waved them over. Daniel, sensing the shift in attention, guided Max back to the porch. The children gathered around, barely containing their excitement. With a flourish, Sarah presented a homemade poster. In bright, bold letters it proclaimed, "Max, Fairview's hero dog." Below the text was a crayon drawing of a German shepherd wearing a cape, standing protectively over a group of stick figure people. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she took in the children's artwork. "Oh my," she said softly. "This is wonderful. Max, look what the children made for you." Max, ever attuned to Margaret's emotions, pressed close to her side, his tail wagging gently as he surveyed the poster and the beaming faces of the children. "We wanted to thank him," Sarah explained earnestly. "My mom says he keeps our whole neighborhood safe now." Daniel, who had been watching the scene with a grin, spoke up. "You know, Mrs. Whitmore, I think Sarah's mom is right. Max here has become quite the local celebrity. People in town are always asking me about him when I'm out on our walks." As if to prove Daniel's point, a car slowed as it passed the house, the driver waving cheerfully at the gathered group on the porch. Margaret waved back, marveling at how much more connected she felt to her community than she had just a few months ago. The children's visit sparked an idea in Margaret's mind. That evening, as she shared a cup of tea with Inspector Turner during one of his regular check-ins, she broached the subject. "Jack," she began, still somewhat unused to using the inspector's first name despite his insistence, "I've been thinking. All these people want to meet Max, to hear his story. What if we could use that somehow? To help others, I mean." Inspector Turner leaned forward, intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" Margaret's eyes lit up as she outlined her idea. A program that would bring retired service dogs like Max to visit schools, senior centers, and hospitals. The dogs could provide comfort and companionship, while their handlers could share stories about the important work these animals do. "We could call it Paws for Heroes," she finished, a bit breathless with excitement. Inspector Turner's face broke into a wide grin. "Margaret, that's brilliant. It would be great for community relations, and I know there are other retired canines in the area who could participate. Plus," he added with a chuckle, "I have a feeling Max here isn't quite ready to fully retire from public service." At the sound of his name, Max lifted his head from where he'd been dozing at Margaret's feet, looking between the two humans with interest. Over the next few weeks, Margaret threw herself into bringing Paws for Heroes to life. She worked with Inspector Turner to contact other handlers of retired service dogs. She spoke with the principal of the local elementary school about setting up regular visits. She even found herself in meetings with the mayor, discussing how the program could benefit the entire town. Through it all, Max remained her steadfast companion. He seemed to sense the importance of their new mission, carrying himself with an air of gentle dignity that never failed to impress those they met. The program's official launch was scheduled for a warm Saturday in May. The town square had been transformed for the occasion, with booths set up to provide information about various community services. A small stage had been erected in the center, where the mayor would give a speech to kick off the event. As Margaret stood off to the side, waiting for their turn to be introduced, she felt a moment of panic. What was she doing here? She was just an old woman who had stumbled into an extraordinary situation. How could she possibly speak in front of all these people? As if sensing her distress, Max pressed against her leg, looking up at her with those soulful eyes. Margaret took a deep breath, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. She thought of all they had been through together, of the lives they had already touched. They could do this. When the mayor called them to the stage, Margaret walked with her head held high, Max a steady presence at her side. As she began to speak, telling the story of that stormy night and all that had followed, she saw faces in the crowd light up with interest and emotion. People leaned in, captivated by the tale of an unlikely friendship that had blossomed into something that could benefit the entire community. As she concluded her speech, introducing the other handlers and dogs who would be part of Paws for Heroes, Margaret felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced before. This was more than just a program, it was a legacy, a way to ensure that the magic she had found with Max could touch countless other lives. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Margaret found herself moving from booth to booth, Max always by her side, greeting people and sharing their story. Children flocked to pet Max, while their parents listened intently to Margaret's gentle words about compassion and community. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the town square, Margaret found a quiet moment to sit on a bench, Max resting at her feet. Inspector Turner joined them, handing Margaret a much-needed bottle of water. "You did it, Margaret," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Look around. You've brought the whole town together." Margaret surveyed the scene before her. Families lingered, chatting with neighbors they might have only waved to before. Children played under the watchful eyes of parents and the gentle presence of the service dogs. There was a palpable sense of connection in the air, a feeling of a community united. "We did it," Margaret corrected gently, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. "I couldn't have done any of this without him. Or without you," she added, smiling at the inspector. As they sat in companionable silence, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the lonely widow facing a long, cold winter, to the center of a community initiative that promised to bring warmth and connection to so many. All because she had opened her door on a stormy night to a dog in need. Later that evening, as Margaret prepared for bed, she paused by the window. The street below was quiet, but it no longer felt lonely. In each house, she knew, were people she now considered friends. And here, in her own home, was Max, her protector, her companion, her inspiration. "Well, old friend," she said softly, as Max settled onto his bed beside hers, "who would have thought we'd end up here?" Max's tail thumped against the floor, his eyes fixed on her with that look of understanding that still amazed her. As Margaret slipped under the covers, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The future, which had once seemed like a lonely road stretching out before her, now held the promise of purpose and connection. Together, she and Max had not only found a new chapter for themselves but had opened the door for others to find healing, comfort, and community. In the quiet of the night, as Fairview slumbered peacefully around them, Margaret drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new chances to make a difference. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever came their way, she and Max would face it together, two unlikely heroes, leaving a legacy of love and compassion in their wake.